A man with nothing left to lose, a choice that cost him everything, and the stranger he protected who would change his entire life forever. There are moments in a man's life when every instinct screams at him to stay quiet, keep his head down, and walk away. Ryan Walker knew that voice well. He'd trained himself to ignore the version of himself that still wanted to fight. But standing in that empty hallway on the 42nd floor of Apex Meridian Corporation at 11:17 on a Tuesday night, watching a powerful man grind a defenseless old woman into the floor with nothing but words, Ryan discovered that some instincts don't die. They just wait. If this story moves you, hit that like button right now and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss the next story. Stories like this one don't come around every day. Now let's begin. The conference room on the 42nd floor smelled like stale coffee and carpet cleaner, and Ryan Walker sat at the far end of the table with his sleeves rolled up to his elbows, squinting at spreadsheet columns that had stopped making sense 40 minutes ago. It was nearly 11 at night. The Chicago office of Apex Meridian Corporation had mostly emptied out by 7, which was why Ryan preferred to work late. The building got quiet. The politics got quiet. The ambient noise of ambitious people angling for promotions and proximity to power, all of it faded, and Ryan could just work. Do his job, go home, sleep for 5.5 hours, start again. He rubbed his face with both hands and reached for his coffee mug, found it empty, and decided that was probably his cue to pack it in for the night. He was 37 years old. He had a daughter who was 7, a 1-bedroom-and-a-half apartment on the northwest side with a bathroom faucet that dripped every 12 seconds, and a laminated healthcare card in his wallet that he treated with more care than his own ID. He was not an unhappy man exactly. He was a man who understood that certain things cost money, and that money required employment, and that employment required him to be sitting in this chair 6 days a week doing supply chain analysis that he was genuinely good at and never particularly proud of. That was fine. Pride was a luxury. Emma was not a luxury. Emma was everything. He saved the spreadsheet, closed his laptop, and tucked it under his arm. The elevator opened on the 42nd floor with a soft chime, and Ryan stepped in, pressed the lobby button, and leaned against the back wall. His reflection stared back at him from the polished metal doors. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a jaw that looked like it had been cut rather than grown, and dark eyes that people sometimes found unnerving without being able to explain why. He'd been told he looked like a man waiting for something bad to happen. He'd stopped arguing with that description years ago. The elevator slowed and stopped at 38. Ryan straightened slightly out of habit. The doors opened, and the first thing he heard was a man's voice. Sharp, controlled, the kind of voice engineered to make someone feel small. Do you understand what you've done? Do you have any idea what those shoes cost? Ryan saw them before he stepped off. He hadn't intended to step off. He'd intended to let the doors close. The hallway of the 38th floor was mostly dark, lit by the ambient glow of the cleaning crew's utility cart parked against the wall. A woman, older, maybe 60, maybe more, with gray hair pulled back tight and a dark green uniform that hung loose on a frame that suggested she'd once been bigger before the years started taking their cut, stood with her back pressed against the wall and her hands clasped in front of her like she was trying to make herself disappear. In front of her stood Damian Cross. Ryan knew Damian Cross the way anyone in the company knew Damian Cross. By reputation first, by proximity second, and by the particular shape of discomfort that moved through a room when he entered it. He was 44, vice president of operations for the Chicago division, and he carried himself with the specific arrogance of a man who had spent his entire career failing upward and mistaking his boss's patience for confirmation of his genius. He was dressed expensively. Charcoal suit, no tie, French cuffs, shoes that probably cost more than Ryan's monthly car payment, and he was standing close enough to the cleaning woman that she had nowhere to retreat to. "Those are Berlutis," Damian said, his voice dropping to something quieter and more dangerous. "You put bleach water on Berlutis. Do you know what bleach does to Italian leather?" "I'm so sorry," the woman said. Her accent was faint. Eastern European, Ryan thought. Polish, maybe. I did not see you come out. The bucket tipped, and I don't care about the bucket. Damien crouched slightly, bringing his face closer to her level. I care that someone who earns what you earn, cleaning floors at midnight, just destroyed property worth more than you make in a month. What am I supposed to do with that? I will eat. She stopped, swallowed. I will pay. Whatever it costs, I will pay. You'll pay. Damien laughed, and it wasn't a pleasant sound. On what? On your salary? That'd be what, 4, 5 months of payments? Or maybe you'd prefer I escalate this to management and we let HR figure out the appropriate response. He paused, letting that sink in. People like you need to understand that there are consequences for carelessness. People like you. Ryan heard those 3 words, and something that had been sitting quiet in his chest for a very long time shifted. He stepped off the elevator. He'd told himself later, replaying it in the way that men replay the moments they can't take back, that he had a plan, that he stepped off with some clear and rational strategy in mind. That wasn't true. The truth was simpler and less flattering. His feet moved before his brain finished the sentence. He walked toward them at an unhurried pace, the kind of pace that said, I was always going to come this way. And when Damien heard the footsteps and looked up, Ryan offered him the mildest possible expression. Hey, Ryan said. Damien blinked. He clearly had not expected company. Who the hell are you? Ryan Walker, supply chain, 42. He glanced at the woman. You okay? She stared at him. She had brown eyes and a face that had logged a lot of weather, and she was looking at him the way people look at something they're not sure is real. She's fine, Damien said. This is a private conversation. I suggest you get back in that elevator. Ryan looked at Damien for a moment, just looked at him. What's the damage? Ryan asked. Excuse me? The shoes. Ryan nodded down at Damien's feet. What's the cleaning bill, or replacement cost if it comes to that? Damien stared at him. I don't know who you think you are. Walker, Ryan said again. Supply chain. I just told you. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out his wallet, a thin, worn thing that folded once and held 3 cards and a small amount of cash. He pulled out 3 20s, looked at them, put one back, held out 2. That cover a cleaning? Because if it's more than that, I'd need an invoice. The woman made a soft sound that might have been a suppressed breath. Damien looked at the 2 20s with an expression that suggested he'd never been more insulted in his life, which was probably true. You're serious? Completely. You realize who I am? You're Damien Cross, VP of Operations, Ryan said. And this is a cleaning woman who accidentally knocked over a bucket, which is not a moral failing. So, cleaning cost or replacement cost? Which is it? The silence stretched for about 4 seconds. Then Damien's face did something Ryan recognized from experience. The controlled recalibration of a man deciding how to punish someone in a way they wouldn't immediately see coming. A slight relaxation of the jaw, a smile that didn't involve the eyes. Keep your $40, Damien said quietly, and enjoy whatever time you have left in this building. He looked at the woman. We're not done, he told her, and then he walked past Ryan toward the elevator, shoulder barely missing a contact that Ryan suspected was intentional. The elevator doors closed. Ryan stood there for a moment, and the part of his brain that handled consequence assessment began running the numbers. He'd just publicly challenged a VP. In an empty building, with no witnesses except a cleaning woman who probably couldn't afford to back his story. At a company where he needed to stay employed because his daughter's cardiologist had his office 2 blocks from the hospital, and Ryan's insurance card was the only reason Emma got to see him every 3 months. The numbers did not come out well. He looked at the woman. She was still pressed against the wall, watching him with that careful, measuring expression. He's going to complain about me, isn't he? Ryan said. It wasn't really a question. I think so, she said. She had a quiet voice, more steady than he expected. I'm sorry. I did not ask for your help. No, you didn't. He exhaled through his nose. He was using a tone I don't have a lot of patience for. She glanced at the elevator. He has a lot of power here. Yeah. Ryan looked at his wallet, still holding the 2 20s. He looked at her more closely. The worn knuckles, the lines around her eyes, the careful economy of her movements. He thought about what it took to be standing in a hallway past 11 at night, cleaning floors for a salary that Damien Cross could burn in a week. You going to be okay? With him, I mean? I have been dealing with men like him for 30 years, she said, with the particular flatness of someone who has in fact been dealing with men like him for 30 years. Ryan nodded slowly. He looked down at the money in his hand. How are you getting home tonight? She paused. There is a bus. At this hour? There is always a bus. He held the 220s out again. Take a cab, or rideshare, whatever. Don't wait for a bus at midnight. She looked at the money, then at him. There was something in her expression he couldn't quite read, a sharpness behind the exhaustion that seemed disproportionate to the situation, like she was filing something away. I can't take your money, she said. It's $40. I'm not buying a yacht. He kept his hand extended. Please. A pause. Then she took it slowly and folded the bills small and tucked them into her uniform pocket. Thank you, Mr. Walker, she said. He almost asked how she knew his last name, then remembered he'd said it twice in front of Damien. Get home safe, he told her, and went back to the elevator. Sit. The apartment was quiet when Ryan got in, which was the best thing about getting home late. Emma was asleep, which meant Emma was not having a bad night, which meant the nebulizer was sitting on the kitchen counter looking decorative instead of necessary, which was how Ryan preferred things. He stood in the doorway of her room for a moment. 7 years old. She was small for her age, with her mother's nose and Ryan's stubbornness and a laugh that could reorganize a room. She slept with one arm thrown over the stuffed rabbit she'd named Gerald for reasons she'd never satisfactorily explained, and her breathing was even and unobstructed, which Ryan assessed in about 2 seconds and then let himself exhale. The heart thing, the cardiologist called it a structural abnormality, which was the medical establishment's way of saying, we can manage this, but we can't make it not exist, wasn't something Emma thought about much. Ryan thought about it constantly, in the specific quiet way that becomes part of the architecture of your daily life, like load-bearing anxiety you've learned to build around. He needed the insurance. That was simply the truth. He went to the kitchen and drank a glass of water standing at the sink and thought about Damien Cross's face when Ryan stepped off that elevator, and thought about how the math on tonight was almost certainly going to be bad. He'd made a choice. He knew he'd made a choice. He also knew if he replayed the scenario in every possible configuration, he would make the same one. That was the thing about the version of himself he'd tried to bury. It wasn't really buried, it was just standing still. He rinsed the glass, dried his hands, and went to check on Emma one more time before he slept. The HR email arrived at 7:43 the next morning. Ryan read it sitting at his kitchen table with Emma's cereal bowl half empty next to his coffee. Emma herself in the bathroom brushing her teeth with the focus of someone performing surgery, and the specific stillness that comes over a person when they read something that confirms what they already knew was coming. Mr. Walker, please report to the Human Resources Office on the 14th floor at 9 a.m. Attendance is mandatory. T. Hendricks, Director of Human Resources, Apex Meridian Corporation. He put his phone face down on the table. Dad? Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway, toothbrush still in hand. Do we have orange juice or just the fake orange juice? What's wrong with the fake orange juice? It doesn't taste like oranges. That's the hallmark of fake, he agreed. Real juice is in the bottom shelf, left side. She disappeared again. He picked up his phone, turned it over, read the email again. He thought about telling himself it might not be what he thought. He decided not to bother. He drove Emma to school, stood in the drop-off line, watched her walk in through the double doors with her backpack listing slightly to the left because she insisted on packing her own bag and had strong opinions about where things went that didn't always align with principles of weight distribution. She turned at the door and waved. He waved back. He sat in the car for a moment after she disappeared inside. Then he drove to Apex Meridian and went up to the 14th floor. T. Hendricks, Director of Human Resources, had the energy of a man who had made peace with being the person who delivered bad news. He offered Ryan a seat, offered Ryan water, and then told Ryan, with the practiced neutrality of someone reading from an internal script, that his employment with Apex Meridian Corporation was being terminated, effective immediately, citing a complaint filed by a senior executive regarding unprofessional and threatening behavior in the workplace. Threatening, Ryan repeated. That's the language in the complaint, yes. I handed someone 2 20s and suggested she take a cab. Hendricks had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. Mr. Walker, I can assure you that HR takes all... What's the severance? Hendricks blinked. I'm sorry? Severance package. I've been here 3 years. What's the standard? Hendricks collected himself and read from a document. 2 weeks per year of service, so 6 weeks, plus any accrued vacation time, health coverage, through the end of the current month. End of the current month. Ryan ran the calendar in his head. Emma had an appointment in 3 weeks. He signed the papers they put in front of him. He shook Hendricks' hand, which seemed to surprise Hendricks. And he went back to the 42nd floor and cleaned out his desk, which took 11 minutes because he had learned, after years of moving in the military and after the particular upheaval that had preceded his arrival at Apex Meridian, to keep his space sparse. He took the elevator down. Outside, it was raining. Chicago in October did not negotiate with you about the weather. It rained until it was done, and then sometimes rained more. Ryan stood under the building's overhang for a moment, looking at the street, the taxis blurring past, the people with their umbrellas. He had no umbrella. He started walking. He was 3 blocks from the building when he heard footsteps behind him. Quick, deliberate, catching up. He stopped and turned. The cleaning woman was there. She was wearing regular clothes, dark slacks, a gray coat, sensible shoes, and she looked different out of the uniform, harder to place, the kind of person who occupied any room without calling attention to herself. She was slightly out of breath from hurrying. "Mr. Walker," she said. "Hi." He waited. "I heard what happened." She looked at him steadily. "You were let go." News travels. "In a building this size, yes." She paused. "I want you to know that I'm sorry. What happened last night, you didn't deserve what it cost you." He looked at her. There was something careful in her eyes, something that didn't match the cleaning cart and the worn uniform, something he'd noticed last night and hadn't been able to place, like a picture hanging slightly wrong on a wall. "It was $40 and a choice I'd make again," he said. "Don't apologize for Damien Cross." "No," she said, and something shifted in her expression. "I'm not." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out something he recognized. 2 folded 20s, the same 2 20s he'd pressed into her hand last night. She held them out. "You'll need this more than I do," she said. "For now." He started to refuse. "Please," she said. And there was something in her voice, not pleading, not pitying, something else entirely, that made him stop. He took the money. "What's your name?" he asked. She held his gaze for a moment. "Margaret," she said. He nodded. "Stay dry, Margaret." She watched him for another second, and then she nodded once and turned and walked back toward the building. Ryan stood in the rain and watched her go, and there was a thing he couldn't name sitting at the edge of his awareness. The picture on the wall, still crooked. He put the $40 in his wallet, turned his collar up against the rain, and started walking toward the train. He needed to figure out his daughter's medical appointment. Everything else could wait. The rain hadn't let up by the time Ryan got home. He stood in the entryway of the apartment for a moment, dripping onto the mat, and did what he'd trained himself to do in situations that required immediate triage. He itemized. 6 weeks severance. 3 weeks until Emma's cardiology appointment with Dr. Patel at Northwestern. Current savings, enough to cover 2 months of rent and utilities if he was careful, 3 if he was very careful, and Emma didn't have a bad stretch. Health coverage through the end of October, which was 22 days away. 22 days. He hung up his wet jacket and went to the kitchen and opened his laptop on the table and started updating his resume. Not because he felt like it, because the alternative was sitting in the chair and thinking about what 22 days meant in practical terms, and that kind of thinking didn't pay rent. He'd been at it for about 40 minutes when his phone buzzed. It was his sister, Carla, calling from Phoenix. He let it ring twice, then picked up. I heard through the industry grapevine that you did something stupid, she said, by way of greeting. Who told you? Nobody told me anything. I'm guessing based on the fact that you never call me on a Wednesday, and you're not calling me now either, which means something happened and you're in your apartment being very quiet about it. A pause. Am I wrong? You're not wrong. What happened? He told her, the short version. The hallway, the cleaning woman, Damien Cross, the HR office, the walk home in the rain. Carla listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her, and when he finished, there was a silence that lasted about 4 seconds. Ryan, I know. Emma has an appointment in 3 weeks. I know, Carla. Okay. Another pause. Do you need money? I can... No. He said it without irritation because she was asking from the right place. I need a job. I'm working on the resume right now. You could move back here. Phoenix has work and I'm 20 minutes away and Emma could... She has a doctor here. She has a school here. I'm not pulling her out of both of those things. Carla made a sound that said she'd expected that answer and was filing her disagreement for later, which was a sound he'd known since childhood. At least let me put feelers out with some of the logistics firms down here. I know a guy at Maersk. Yeah, okay, that would help. And Ryan? Her voice shifted slightly. I'm not saying you were wrong. I'm just saying you have to think about the margin. He knew what she meant. The margin between principle and consequence, the gap he'd spent the better part of 3 years calculating precisely and navigating carefully. He knew the margin. He'd been managing it since before Emma was born, and more acutely since her mother left, and more acutely still since the diagnosis. I know, he said again. They talked for another few minutes. She asked about Emma's school play. He asked about her kids. And then he hung up and went back to the resume. He worked until 2 in the morning and then went to bed and lay in the dark for a while, listening to the rain. Wow. He told Emma in the morning, not the full version, she was 7, and the full version would have scared her. But enough. That he was between jobs, that they'd be careful with money for a little while, that everything was going to work out. Emma ate her cereal and considered this with the particular seriousness she applied to information she was deciding whether to believe. Are we going to have to move? She asked. No. Are we going to lose the apartment? Emma, because Jalen at school said when his dad lost his job, they had to move to his grandma's house and share a room with his cousin. We're not moving to anyone's grandma's house. We don't have a grandma's house anyway. Grandma lives in Phoenix, and her house only has 2 bedrooms. Exactly. So it's a non-issue. Emma looked at him. She had a way of looking at him that had appeared when she was about 4 and had never left. A direct patient assessment, like she was waiting to see if the adult in the room was going to be straight with her. I'm fine, he told her. He meant it as much as he could. I'm good at my job, I'm going to find another one, and your appointment with Dr. Patel is already on the calendar. None of that changes. She accepted this, or decided to accept it, which was its own kind of faith. Okay, she said. Can I have more cereal? He gave her more cereal. He dropped her at school and drove back and applied to 4 jobs before 9 a.m. and thought about the $40 in his wallet, about a woman named Margaret who had pressed them back into his hand with the specific authority of someone who knew something he didn't. He thought about her eyes, the sharpness behind them. He told himself it didn't matter. He had bigger problems than an interesting stranger. 3 days passed, then 4, then a week. He got 1 call back. A logistics coordinator position at a freight company in Schaumburg, an hour commute each way, salary 15% below what he'd been making. He went to the interview. He wore the same suit he'd worn to the HR meeting. The interviewer was 30 years old and kept glancing at Ryan's employment gap from when he'd left the military, asking questions about it with the careful neutrality of someone who didn't know how to ask what he actually wanted to know. Ryan answered them all correctly and drove home and heard nothing. He applied to 6 more positions. He updated his LinkedIn profile, which he hated, and accepted 3 connection requests from people he'd worked with before who sent him messages saying things like, "Let me know if I can help," without offering anything specific. which was the professional equivalent of saying, "I've acknowledged your situation and now consider my obligation discharged." Emma had a bad night on the 8th day. Not cardiac, just respiratory, the kind of wet cough that sounded worse than it was, but still required the nebulizer, and 2 hours of Ryan sitting on the edge of her bed, watching her breathe, telling himself the numbers he knew, SPO, 2 levels, respiratory rates, the particular pitch of her breathing that meant watch versus the pitch that meant hospital. By midnight, she was fine. By 1 a.m., she was asleep. Ryan sat in the kitchen with cold coffee and the particular exhaustion of sustained vigilance and thought about the margin. Carla's word. The margin. He had 11 days until the insurance lapsed. He was in the middle of drafting a cover letter for a supply chain manager position at a medical device company downtown when his phone rang. Unknown number, Chicago area code. He almost let it go to voicemail. Something stopped him. "Ryan Walker," he answered. A pause on the other end, brief, deliberate, the pause of someone who had been listening for something in the way a person said their name. "Mr. Walker." The voice was female, professional, brisk. "My name is Diane Okafor. I'm the executive assistant to the office of the chief executive at Apex Meridian Corporation. I'm calling on behalf of the CEO to invite you to a meeting at the company's headquarters tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Ryan held the phone against his ear and said nothing for a moment. "The CEO," he said. "That's correct. The CEO of Apex Meridian." "Yes, sir." A small pause. "I understand the circumstances of your departure were complicated. The CEO's office is aware of the situation and would like to speak with you directly. This is not a legal matter," she added, which told Ryan that she'd been instructed to say that specifically. "No attorneys, no HR. A private meeting." He turned this over. His first instinct was skepticism. The practiced structural skepticism of someone who had learned in various capacities over the years that surprise invitations from powerful people rarely went the direction the invitation implied. His second instinct was that he had 11 days of insurance and a daughter with a cardiology appointment and no currently viable alternatives. "What time did you say?" he asked. 9 a.m., 22nd floor. Ask for Diane at the reception desk." "I'll be there." He hung up and stared at the wall for a minute. Then he pulled up Apex Meridian's corporate page on his laptop and spent 2 hours reading everything that was publicly available about the company's leadership structure. The CEO of Apex Meridian Corporation was a woman named Victoria Sterling. She was 30 years old. She had founded the company at 24, which alone was the kind of fact that made you read the paragraph twice, and had grown it from a regional logistics firm into a national operation with 11 divisions and somewhere north of 4,000 employees. She had a degree from Northwestern and had reportedly turned down 3 acquisition offers in the past 2 years, the last one valued at somewhere around $2.8 billion. There was a photo on the company's About page, formal headshot, dark blazer, dark hair pulled back, looking at the camera with the particular expression of someone who has learned that the camera captures whatever you give it and has therefore chosen to give it very little. Ryan looked at the photo for a while. Then he went and checked on Emma, who was sleeping soundly, and went to bed. He arrived at Apex Meridian at 8:52. He wore the suit. He'd dry cleaned it over the weekend on the reasonable theory that if you only have one suit, you should at least have a clean one, and he'd shined his shoes the night before with a kit he kept under the bathroom sink from long habit. He looked like what he was, a man who took care of what he had because he didn't have much room for carelessness. Diane Okafor met him at the reception desk. She was 50-ish, with natural gray hair and the calm efficiency of a person who had spent years managing the logistics of someone else's time. She shook his hand, led him to the elevator, pressed 22, and did not make small talk, which Ryan appreciated. "The meeting is in the private conference room," she said as the elevator rose. "There are several other attendees. The CEO will address you directly." "Several other attendees," he repeated. "Yes." "Can you tell me who?" She glanced at him with what might have been the ghost of a smile. "You'll see in a moment." The 22nd floor was different from the 42nd, quieter, more deliberate, the kind of space that communicated this is where decisions get made without needing to say it. The carpet was darker, the lighting warmer. The art on the walls actual art rather than the generic abstracts that decorated every other floor. Diane stopped at a set of double doors and opened the right one. Ryan walked in. The conference room was long, oval-tabled, with a view of Lake Michigan through floor-to-ceiling glass that was, objectively, a remarkable view. Around the table sat 6 people, men in suits with the particular tight-jawed look of people bracing for something they weren't sure about. Ryan recognized 2 of them. One was a man from the legal department he'd seen in the halls occasionally, and the other was Thomas Bright, the Chicago Division's chief operating officer, who was sitting very still in the way that people sit when their equilibrium is compromised. At the far end of the room, standing at the window with his back to the door, was Damian Cross. And standing at the head of the table, reviewing something on a tablet, was a woman Ryan had never seen before. Except that he had. He knew he had. He was certain of it before she even looked up. There was something in the set of her shoulders, in the quality of her stillness, in the economy of how she held herself. The same thing he'd noticed in that hallway on the 38th floor and hadn't been able to name. She looked up. Brown eyes. The lines around them. Less pronounced now, without exhaustion. The sharp intelligence behind them, which was exactly the same. Margaret. The woman who had mopped floors and pressed 220s back into his hand in the rain. She held his gaze for exactly 1 second, and in that second Ryan processed several things simultaneously. The picture on the wall, finally straight, the way she'd known his last name, the specific quality of her watch, which he'd noticed and dismissed. The phrase, "I'm not apologizing for Damian Cross," which had struck him as an odd construction and now struck him as something else entirely. He kept his face still. It was one of the things he was good at. "Mr. Walker," she said, "please sit down." Her voice was different, or not different. The same voice, the same slight steadiness, but without the careful flattening she'd applied in the hallway. This was her actual register, clear, direct, pitched to a room. Ryan sat. Damian turned from the window. He saw Ryan, and the set of his jaw changed. Not dramatically. A small tightening. The recalibration of a man who had walked into a room confident and found an unexpected variable. He recovered quickly, the way practiced men recover quickly, and moved to his chair and sat down with the deliberate ease of someone performing calm. "Victoria," Damian said, with the smooth familiarity of someone who wanted the room to know he was on first-name terms with the CEO. "I didn't realize this meeting included—" "It does," she said. She did not look at him. She set her tablet down and looked at the room, at each face in turn, and then last at Ryan. "I'll give you the short version," Victoria Sterling said, "and then we'll deal with the details. 14 weeks ago, I came to Chicago to conduct a personal review of this division. I had received reports suggesting financial irregularities, management misconduct, and a culture of fear that was suppressing internal compliance concerns. I reviewed those reports, I found them credible, and I decided to see the situation for myself rather than rely on accounts from people whose continued employment might color their perspective." She paused to let that land. "I took a position with the building's contracted cleaning service under a modified identity. I worked nights for 6 weeks. I wanted to see this division as it actually operated, not as it presented itself to corporate oversight." Thomas Bright had the look of a man doing quiet internal arithmetic on decisions he'd made in the past 6 weeks. "What I found," Victoria continued, "was broadly consistent with the reports. There are financial discrepancies in the Chicago Division's operational accounts that I will address separately with the relevant parties." She let her eyes travel around the table briefly, and Ryan noticed that every person at the table except him and Damian seemed to shrink slightly into their chair. "What I did not anticipate was what I witnessed on the night of October 14th. Damian shifted in his seat. "On that night," Victoria said, "a senior executive of this company spent approximately 20 minutes in a private hallway verbally demeaning a cleaning employee in a manner that I would characterize as deliberately humiliating. An exercise of power with no purpose except to establish that he had it and she did not. During this incident, every employee on that floor who was aware of it, and there were 3 in addition to myself, chose not to intervene." Silence. "One person did intervene." She looked at Ryan. He got off an elevator he had no reason to leave, offered to cover the cost of the damaged property, and when that offer was refused, did not escalate or retaliate. He then ensured the employee had a safe way home, after which he was terminated the following morning on the complaint of the same executive. Damien opened his mouth. "I'm going to stop you," Victoria said, without looking at him, "because anything you say in this room in the next 60 seconds is going to make your situation measurably worse." Damien closed his mouth. Ryan sat very still. He was watching Victoria Sterling the way he watched things he was trying to understand. Not staring, just attending. She was 30 years old, which he knew from reading, but which still registered differently in person. She had the particular quality of someone who had been underestimated enough times that she'd stopped being surprised by it and started using it. She reached into the leather folder in front of her and produced something small, which she placed on the table and slid toward the center. 2 $20 bills, folded small. "Mr. Walker gave me this," she said, "for cab fare. I returned it when he was terminated because I didn't want him to need it. I've been carrying it since then." She looked at Ryan. "I have a habit of keeping things that remind me of something important." The room was very quiet. Damien Cross had gone the specific color of a man who understands, with clarity, that the floor has dropped out from underneath him. "Damien," Victoria said, still not looking at him, still looking at the 220s on the table. "Your employment with Apex Meridian Corporation is terminated, effective today, for cause. The causes include falsification of operational reporting data, creation of a hostile work environment as documented across multiple witness accounts gathered during the past 14 weeks, and conduct unbecoming a senior leader as personally witnessed by the CEO. Security will accompany you to your office to collect your personal belongings. Your access credentials will be revoked as of this meeting." She looked up. "You can go now," she said. Damien Cross stood. He stood the way men stand when they have no remaining move, slowly, like he was testing the ground. He looked at Ryan, and the expression on his face was something Ryan cataloged without responding to, the way you catalog the weather. He left the room. One of the suited men by the door, legal, Ryan remembered, stood and followed him. The room exhaled. Victoria looked at the remaining faces around the table. "I have individual conversations scheduled with each of you. For now, I'd ask everyone except Mr. Walker to wait in the adjoining room. Diane will bring you in one at a time." She glanced at Bright. "Thomas, stay." The room emptied. Bright stayed, looking like a man holding very still in proximity to something large and unpredictable. And then it was the three of them, Ryan, Victoria, and Thomas Bright, and the view of Lake Michigan, and 2 $20 bills on the oval table. Victoria sat down. It was the first time Ryan had seen her sit, and there was something in it, a small release of tension in the shoulders, that was recognizably human. She looked across the table at Ryan. "I owe you an apology," she said. Ryan waited. "I should have identified myself that night. I chose not to because I was still gathering information and I didn't know at that point what I was going to find or who I could trust. But my choices that night had consequences for you that were," she paused, choosing the word carefully, "unacceptable. You lost your income. You lost your health coverage. I'm aware you have a daughter with a medical condition. I'm aware her next appointment is in 11 days. Ryan looked at her. "How do you know about Emma's appointment?" "I know what I need to know about my employees. That was true before this, and it's more relevant now." She didn't say it like it was a defense. She said it like a fact. "I'm not telling you that to demonstrate surveillance. I'm telling you because I want you to understand that I'm not treating this as an abstract HR matter. I'm treating it as something I have a direct responsibility for." "Okay," Ryan said. He kept his voice even. "What does that mean, practically?" Victoria glanced at Bright, who had taken out a folder and was now sitting with the careful attention of a man who understood his job in this moment was to be useful. "It means," Victoria said, "that I want to offer you a position, not the position you had, a different one." She nodded to Bright, who opened the folder and produced a single sheet of paper. Clean, minimal, just type. He slid it across the table to Ryan. Ryan looked at it. Regional Operations Director, Chicago Division. The salary figure at the top of the page was a number that Ryan read twice, not because he didn't understand it the first time, but because he needed a second pass to make sure he was reading it correctly. The Chicago division needs leadership, Victoria said. Not management, leadership. There's a difference, and it's a difference this office has not had. The person who held the position Damien Cross held was not a leader. He was a power structure. What I need is someone who understands the difference between those two things from the inside out. Ryan set the sheet of paper down. I'm a supply chain specialist. You were. You're also a former Navy SEAL who spent 3 years in a mid-level position in my company and never once complained about it, never once leveraged your background for advancement, never once made yourself conspicuous, until the night it actually mattered. She held his gaze. That tells me something about how you make decisions. It might also tell you I've been hiding, Ryan said. She considered that with a seriousness that suggested she'd already considered it. Maybe, but hiding and choosing where to spend your energy aren't always different things. She paused. I'm not asking you to be something you're not. I'm asking you to run an operation, protect the people in it, and tell me the truth about what's actually happening in this division. I have enough people who tell me what I want to hear. The view outside was gray and wide. The lake flat under overcast sky, the city stacked up against the western horizon. Ryan looked at it for a moment and then looked at the sheet of paper, and then looked at Victoria Sterling, who was watching him with the patient attention of someone who had already made her decision and was waiting to see if he'd made his. The healthcare coverage, he said. It starts when? The offer letter includes a provision for immediate coverage, as of your start date, which I'd want to be Monday. Monday is 4 days away. I'm aware. Ryan was quiet for a moment. He thought about Emma in the kitchen that morning. She'd wanted to make her own toast and had burned it and announced that burned toast was actually good if you put enough butter on it, a position she'd defended with more conviction than it warranted. He thought about the nebulizer on the counter. He thought about Dr. Patel's office, the waiting room with the fish tank, Emma pressing her face against the glass. He thought about a woman in a cleaning uniform pressing 220s into his hand in the rain and the thing in her eyes he hadn't been able to name. He picked up the sheet of paper. I have one condition, he said. Victoria waited. The woman who was in that hallway, the actual cleaning employee, I don't know her name. She was afraid of losing her job over a bucket of water. Whatever situation she was in with Damien Cross, I want to know it's been addressed. Not as a legal matter, just addressed. Victoria looked at him for a moment without expression. Then something shifted in her face, not quite a smile, more the settling of something that had been slightly out of alignment. Her name is Renata, Victoria said. She's been with the cleaning service for 11 years. As of this morning, she's been offered a permanent facilities management position with Apex Meridian directly, with full benefits, at twice her current salary. She paused. I'd already handled it. Ryan nodded slowly. Okay, he said. Okay, you accept? Okay, I accept. Thomas Bright uncapped a pen and slid a second sheet of paper across the table, the actual offer letter, formal, with a line at the bottom. And Ryan read it through without rushing because he had learned a long time ago that the value of reading something carefully was that you only had to do it once. He signed it. Victoria picked it up and looked at it and set it in her folder. She looked across the table at him. I should tell you, she said, that this division is a significant problem. The financial situation is complicated, the culture is damaged, and the people who've been working here under Damien Cross are going to take time to trust any kind of management again. This isn't going to be easy. No, Ryan agreed. You're not concerned about that? He thought about it honestly for a second. I've had harder assignments. She looked at him with that quality again. The one he'd noticed in the hallway, the one he'd noticed in the rain, the same sharpness behind the same brown eyes, watching him the way she'd been watching him since the first night she handed him a mop bucket and stood back to see what he'd do. I imagine you have, she said. He called Carla from the parking garage. The Maersk guy, he said when she answered. Tell him never mind. A pause. Ryan. I'm good, Carla, I'm good. She made the sound that meant she was going to demand the full story in the immediate future, but was currently too relieved to lead with that. Emma's appointment is covered, all of it. I'll explain later. He sat in the car for a minute after he hung up. The parking garage was dim and smelled like exhaust and damp concrete, and it was utterly unremarkable, and Ryan Walker sat in it and breathed out. A long, slow exhale, the kind that costs something, and then started the car. He needed to pick up Emma from school. He needed to stop at the grocery store because they were out of the cereal she liked. He needed to call Dr. Patel's office and confirm the appointment, not because it was in danger now, but because confirming things was a habit he'd built for good reasons. He pulled out of the garage into the gray Chicago afternoon. In his wallet, two $20 bills sat folded in the bill slot, and he hadn't decided yet what to do with them, whether to spend them or keep them, whether they were money now or something else. He thought he'd figure it out later. Right now he had a daughter to pick up, and that was enough. Emma burned her toast again on Monday morning. Ryan was in the bedroom knotting his tie, a thing he'd owned for 4 years and worn to 3 funerals and 2 job interviews, when he heard the smoke alarm beep twice and then stop, which meant Emma had gotten to it with the dish towel before it fully triggered, which meant she'd been watching for it, which meant she'd burned toast before without telling him. He came out of the bedroom. She was standing at the toaster with the dish towel over her shoulder like a line cook, looking at 2 slices of bread that were charcoal at the edges and pale in the middle. "I had a system," she said, before he could speak, "but it didn't work." "What was the system?" "I was going to watch it the whole time, but then I got distracted." "By what?" "By watching it." She frowned at the toast. "It takes a really long time, and then very fast it doesn't." Ryan looked at the toast, then at his daughter. She was wearing her school clothes, jeans, a blue sweater that was getting short in the sleeves, and her hair was half done, one side in a braid she'd managed herself, and the other side still loose. She'd been trying to learn to braid her own hair for 6 weeks. He'd offered to help. She'd declined, on the grounds that she needed to learn it herself, a position she held with the consistency of someone 3 times her age. "It's fine," he said. "Butter covers a lot of sins." "That's what I said before." "It's still true." He buttered the toast while she finished her hair, or tried to. She came to the kitchen table after 4 minutes with the second braid approximately right, and a look on her face that suggested she knew it wasn't quite right, and had decided to let it stand anyway. Ryan ate a piece of the burned toast himself, because he'd said butter covered it, and he was going to stand behind that. "You look different," Emma said, studying him. "I'm wearing a tie." "You look nervous." He poured her juice. "I'm not nervous." "You're doing the thing with your jaw." He consciously unclenched his jaw. "I'm not doing anything with my jaw." Emma ate her toast with the satisfaction of someone who has successfully identified a thing and is content to let it sit there identified. She didn't push, which was something he'd noticed about her. She made her observation, put it on the table, and moved on. She was 7, and she was already more precise about people than most adults he'd worked with. "Is the new job going to be okay?" she asked. "Yeah," he said. "I think it's going to be good." She considered that. "Is it for the same company?" "Same company, different job." "The one where the mean man worked?" He told her a simplified version, that someone at work had been unkind to a person who needed help, and Ryan had said something about it, and the people in charge had found out and decided to make things right. She'd accepted this with the fairness radar of a 7-year-old, which was finely calibrated and somewhat exhausting. "The mean man doesn't work there anymore," Ryan said. "Good," she said, with finality, and went back to her toast. But he dropped her at school and drove downtown and sat in the parking garage of Apex Meridian for 4 minutes longer than he needed to. He wasn't nervous, or he was nervous in the specific way that he'd trained himself to process, as information rather than feeling, as a signal about the situation rather than a commentary on his capability. New environment, elevated stakes, reduced certainty. The nervous system's appropriate response. He acknowledged it, cataloged it, and got out of the car. Diane Okafor met him in the lobby with a badge, a temporary parking pass, and a 45-minute orientation condensed into 12 because, as she put it, most of it you'll figure out by being here, and the parts you won't figure out, I'll tell you directly. He liked Diane. His office was on the 22nd floor, not Victoria's floor, which was 23, but adjacent. It was a real office, with a door and a window and a desk that was much larger than anything he'd previously occupied at the company, and it contained, as of Monday morning, almost nothing, because whoever had cleaned out Damien Cross's possessions had done a thorough job and left the space with the blank institutional quality of a hotel room between guests. Ryan set his laptop bag on the desk and stood at the window for a moment. Different view from up here. The street ran east-west, and he could see the river, the bridges, the particular gray-green of Chicago water in October morning light. He turned around and started figuring out what he'd walked into. Well, the first meeting was at 10, and it was with the department heads of the Chicago division. 6 of them, ranging in age from roughly 35 to somewhere in their late 50s. They filed in with the careful, non-committal body language of people who have recently survived a significant institutional event and are not yet sure what comes next. Ryan had seen this posture before, in different contexts. It was the posture of people recalibrating. He didn't give them a speech. He'd considered it and decided against it, because the speeches people gave on their first day in a new leadership role were almost universally aimed at making the speaker feel settled, rather than at actually communicating something. He had a legal pad in front of him, and he put it down flat, and he looked around the table. "I want to start with something simple," he said. "I want each of you to tell me one thing about this division that you think I need to know, that you weren't able to say out loud 6 months ago." Silence. The particular silence of people deciding whether the invitation was real. The woman at his left, Sandra Coe, logistics, late 40s, with the look of someone who had been good at her job for a long time without recognition, looked at him. He'd read her file that morning. 22 years with the company, 8 in the Chicago division, consistently rated exceeds expectations, consistently passed over for promotion. The Q3 regional numbers were revised, she said, 3 times. Each revision brought them closer to Damien's targets. I have the original versions in my files if anyone wants to see them. She said it the way you say something you've been holding for a long time, not with drama, just with the flatness of sustained compression finally releasing. Ryan wrote something on his legal pad. "Thank you," he said. "Who else?" It took another 30 seconds for the next person to speak, but after that they didn't stop for 40 minutes. He wrote it all down. He didn't interrupt, didn't qualify, didn't offer reassurance. He let them talk, and he listened the way he'd learned to listen in environments where missing something could have consequences. Not passively, but actively, tracking the connections between what people said and what they didn't say. The things that came up twice from different angles, the hesitations that marked the places where someone was still deciding whether to trust him. When they were done, he looked around the table. "I'm going to need time with each of you individually," he said. "I'm going to need the original Q3 files Sandra mentioned, and I'm going to need someone to walk me through the operational structure of this division as it actually functions, not as it's charted." He paused. "I'm not here to audit you. I'm here because something in this division stopped working, and I've been asked to figure out what it needs to run right. That's a different thing." Sandra Coe looked at him with an expression that was not quite trust yet, but was one step removed from it. The look of someone who is choosing, provisionally, to believe. "One more thing," Ryan said. "Whatever you were afraid to say before, I'm not Damien Cross. I'm going to make mistakes, and some of my decisions are going to be wrong, and when they are, I need someone in this room to tell me. That's not a formality. I actually need it." The meeting ended. People filed out with the slightly lighter movement of people who have put something down. Sandra Coe lingered. "I have 3 years of original reports," she said quietly, when the others were gone. "Everything that got revised. I kept copies." "Why?" Ryan asked. She looked at him steadily. "Because I thought someone was going to need them eventually." "Can you get them to me this week?" "I can have them to you by this afternoon." "Good." He looked at her. "You should have been running this department years ago." She blinked. Then she looked at the door, then back at him. "I'm aware," she said, dry as chalk, and left. He had lunch alone at his desk, a sandwich from the cart in the lobby that was fine in the specific way that lobby sandwiches are fine, and spent the afternoon reading. Sandra's files arrived at 2:15. 3 years of operational reports, original and revised versions side by side, with handwritten margin notes in Sandra's precise script marking the discrepancies. Ryan read through them with the focused attention he brought to problems that had structure underneath the noise, pulling at threads until the shape of things started to come clear. The shape was not good. Damian Cross had been running a systematic distortion of divisional performance data, inflating revenue figures, underreporting costs, reclassifying capital expenditures to make quarterly numbers hit targets that the division was not actually hitting. The practical effect was that the Chicago division had been receiving resources and investment it hadn't earned, while divisions that were genuinely performing well were being comparatively underfunded. It was the kind of manipulation that could run for a long time without triggering obvious alarms, especially if the people positioned to notice it were either complicit or afraid. 3 people were complicit. He identified them from the patterns in the files, the timing of the revisions, the routing of the approval chains, the specific nature of what got changed and what didn't. He made a list. He sat with it for a few minutes. Then he called Diane. "I need 30 minutes with Victoria," he said. "Today if possible, tomorrow morning at the latest." "She has a gap at 4:30 today," Diane said. "I'll take it." Victoria Sterling's office occupied the northwest corner of 23 and had the view Ryan's office had plus 30 additional degrees of Lake Michigan, which on a clear day was probably extraordinary, and on a late October afternoon was a flat expanse of pewter-colored water disappearing into low cloud. She was at her desk when he came in, not sitting behind it in the formal arrangement but sideways, one leg up, reading something on a tablet with the unhurried concentration of someone for whom the performance of being busy was not required. She looked up when he came in. "Monday," she said. "How bad is it?" He put Sandra's files on her desk, a 4-inch stack of folders, and sat down across from her. "The financial manipulation goes back at least 3 years, probably longer, but I'd need the full audit trail to be certain." He had help. 3 people on the divisional team that I can identify from the document patterns, possibly more. He paused. "You should have your financial forensics people look at the original data before anyone in the division knows they're looking." Victoria had set down the tablet. She was looking at the stack of folders with an expression that was not surprise, not quite, but was something adjacent to it. The expression of someone who expected to find termites and has found them, and is in the specific moment of confirming the scale. "How did you identify this in one day?" she asked. "I had help from a department head who'd been keeping the originals." He thought about Sandra Coe and her 3 years of filed copies, and the particular faith that implied, the faith of someone who believed, despite all evidence, that someone would eventually show up and need them. "She's going to need a title adjustment. She's been carrying this division's institutional memory on her own for years." Victoria looked at him. "Who?" "Sandra Coe, Logistics." "I know the name?" She was quiet for a moment. "All right. I'll have our forensics team here by Wednesday with access limited to your direct authorization and mine. Nobody in the division knows they're coming." "Good." She leaned back. The late afternoon light from the window came in at a low angle and caught the edge of her face. She looked for a moment like someone much closer to 30 than the composed executive presence the photo on the About page had suggested, which she was. She was 30, which Ryan was still adjusting to, not because it changed his assessment of her competence, which the evidence had settled, but because it was simply a fact that required a moment of recalibration. "You're going to tell me something else," she said. "The 3 people who were involved in the revisions, I can tell you who they are, but I'd recommend you let me manage how we handle it. If you move on them too quickly, anyone else who was peripherally involved goes underground. I need 2 weeks to assess who can be retrained and who needs to go." She considered this. "You want to manage the internal personnel process." "I want to manage it carefully. There's a difference." She almost smiled at that, a brief compression at the corner of her mouth that she didn't let develop. 2 weeks, she said, with updates to me every 3 days. "Done." He stood. She picked up the top folder from Sandra's stack and opened it, and Ryan was almost to the door when she spoke again. "Ryan." He turned. She was still looking at the folder. "How's Emma?" He stood in the doorway for a second. He thought about the burned toast and the half-finished braid and the matter-of-fact way his 7-year-old had told him he was doing the thing with his jaw. "She burned breakfast again this morning," he said. "She's fine." Victoria nodded, still reading. "Good," she said. He went back to his office. The appointment with Dr. Patel was on a Thursday, 11 days after Ryan's first day. He'd taken the morning off. He'd told Diane, who had told him that as regional operations director, he did not technically need to tell anyone when he was taking a morning, a point Ryan understood intellectually and was going to need more time to internalize. He drove Emma to Northwestern, parked in the hospital garage, walked her through the lobby with its fish tank that she still pressed her face against, and sat in the waiting room while she was taken back for her echo. He'd been to this office 4 times. He knew the chairs, blue upholstered, slightly too low, and the magazines, which were always 2 months old, and the particular sound of the elevator down the hall, and the way the light came in through the frosted window at a certain angle in the morning. He knew these things the way you know the geography of places where you've waited for important information. They get mapped differently in the brain. Dr. Patel came out after 40 minutes. A small woman in her 50s with reading glasses pushed up on her head and the unhurried manner of a person who has delivered a lot of news of various kinds and has learned to lead with the important part. "She's doing well," Dr. Patel said, sitting down across from him. "The measurements are stable. We're not seeing any progression." Ryan breathed out. "We'll want to see her again in 4 months," Dr. Patel continued. "And I want to add a Holter monitor for the next 2 weeks just to get a baseline rhythm record. It's a precaution, not a concern. But overall, she looks good. She's a healthy kid." She's a healthy kid. Ryan had been hearing some version of those words every 3 months for 2 years. And every time they landed the same way, with a weight of relief so significant it almost felt like a physical thing, a set down of something he'd been carrying. "Thank you," he said. Dr. Patel smiled. The practiced, genuine kind, not the clinical kind. "She told me she's learning to braid her own hair." "She is. She's persistent." "She also told me you make good burned toast." Ryan laughed, a short, real one. "She's a generous critic." Emma appeared from the back, dressed again with a small adhesive patch on her left arm where they'd drawn blood for routine labs, which she was displaying with the pride of someone who has endured something and wants credit for it. She went immediately to the fish tank and stood in front of it with her hands behind her back. "The orange one is new," she announced. "The last time I was here there were only 2 orange ones and now there are 3. "Maybe they had a baby," Ryan said. Emma looked at him patiently. "Fish don't have babies like that, Dad. They lay eggs." "I know that." "Then why did you say that?" Conversational habit. She looked at the fish tank for another few seconds. "Can we get a fish?" "We can talk about it." "That means no." "It means we can talk about it," he said, which they both knew meant the same thing, and Emma accepted this without argument in the way she accepted the things she'd learned to pick her battles about. They walked to the car. Emma's hand found his in the parking garage, the way it did sometimes. Not because she was scared or tired, just because it was there. He'd noticed when she'd started doing it about a year ago, and had never said anything about it because saying something would make it self-conscious, and he wanted it to remain unexamined for as long as possible. They drove home. Emma ate a lunch that did not involve toast, told him about a disagreement she'd had with Jalen about whether sharks were technically fish. She maintained they were, he maintained they weren't, they were still negotiating, and asked if she could watch 45 minutes of television, which Ryan said yes to, and which she took full and precise advantage of. He sat at the kitchen table with his laptop, reading the forensic team's preliminary report, which had arrived that morning. It confirmed what Sandra's files had suggested and then went further. The manipulation was systemic. It had been running for 4 years, and the total financial distortion across that period amounted to a number with 7 figures. He sent Victoria the report with a brief note. As expected. Possibly worse. Talk tomorrow. She responded in 11 minutes. Yes, good work today. Not the report. This morning. He sat with that for a second. He hadn't mentioned the appointment to her since the day he'd signed the offer letter. She'd remembered it. He wasn't sure how he felt about that. He wrote back, "She's stable." Then he put his phone down. The 2 weeks he'd asked for turned into 12 days, which was how it usually went when you applied sustained attention to a problem. It compressed. He met with each of the 3 implicated employees individually in Ryan's office, with Diane present as a witness, and he gave each of them a version of the same conversation. What he knew, what the forensic team had confirmed, and what their options were. Two of them cooperated fully and were placed on performance improvement plans with the understanding that any future integrity issue would result in immediate termination. Not because Ryan believed performance improvement plans fixed people, but because they'd been operating under a culture of coercion and deserved a chance to demonstrate who they were outside of it. The third was a man named Carl Eston, who ran divisional procurement and who received Ryan's account of what the forensic team had found with the specific stillness of someone calculating whether denial was still viable. "I want to talk to a lawyer," Carl said. "That's your right," Ryan said. "HR will be in contact. You can take the rest of the day." Carl looked at him. Damien said this was just how things worked. Ryan looked back at him. "I know," he said. "That's why Damien doesn't work here anymore." Carl left. Ryan sat in his office for 10 minutes after, not doing anything in particular, just sitting the way he'd learned to sit after difficult conversations that required a certain amount of internal accounting before you could move on to the next thing. Sandra Coe appeared in his open doorway. She knocked on the frame, even though the door was open, which was a habit he'd come to appreciate. "Carl's gone?" she asked. "For today." She nodded. She came in and sat down, not invited but not unwelcome, in the chair across from his desk. "3 of us filed internal complaints about the reporting irregularities," she said. 2 years ago. Nothing happened." "I know, I read the complaint files. The complaints went to Damien." Ryan looked at her. "I know that too. I want to know if it happens again, whatever I see, whoever I tell, whether it's actually going to go somewhere." It was a fair question. It was the right question. He thought about how to answer it in a way that was honest rather than reassuring, because there was a difference, and she had enough experience to know the difference. "I can't promise you a system that doesn't fail," he said. "What I can tell you is that anything you bring to me goes up to Victoria directly if I'm part of the problem, and anything that goes to Victoria doesn't get buried. I've seen her handle a situation where the safe play was to do nothing. She didn't do nothing." Sandra considered this. "The cleaning woman." He looked at her. "Everyone heard eventually," Sandra said, "that she was the CEO, that she'd been here for 6 weeks watching." She paused. Most people were relieved. Some people were scared, which tells you something about what they'd been doing. A dry pause. I thought it was something." "Yeah," Ryan said. "It was something." Sandra stood. She put her hands in her pockets. She looked at him with the steady, measuring look that he'd come to understand was her default expression and not a sign of skepticism. "Renata called me," she said. "Renata from the cleaning crew?" "Renata, who now runs facilities management for this building. She called to ask me how the division felt under the new director." She paused. "I told her I'd let her know." Ryan waited. "I'll let her know in a few more weeks," Sandra said, "when I have more data." "That's fair." "It is," she agreed, and went back to her department. "What?" Victoria called him at 7:43 that evening. He was at the kitchen table. Emma was asleep. The apartment was quiet. The nebulizer was decorative. And he had 3 reports open on his laptop and a cold cup of coffee at his elbow. "The board met today," she said when he picked up. No preamble. "And?" "The forensic findings went to the full board this afternoon. They're approving a restatement of 4 years of Chicago divisional reports and a full independent audit of 2 other divisions where Cross had operational influence." Ryan absorbed that. How does the board feel about the CEO personally taking a covert operations position in a regional office for 6 weeks? A pause on the line. "Divided," she said. 3 of them think it was reckless. 2 of them think it was inspired. The rest are still deciding which posture is safer. "What do you think?" "I think I found what I needed to find. A beat. And I think it cost someone who didn't deserve it 2 weeks of serious stress and a gap in health coverage, which is a ledger entry I'm still working on." "I signed the offer letter," Ryan said. "That settled the ledger." "Maybe from your side." He was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the city did what it did at this hour. The specific sound of Chicago at nearly 8 on a Thursday, the middle distance of sirens and traffic, the closer sound of someone in the apartment above walking in that particular heavy-heeled way that Ryan had learned to identify as the upstairs neighbor, Mr. Alvarez, coming home from his shift. Victoria, he said, how much of the past 12 days was you testing whether you'd made the right call on the offer? She didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice was slightly different. Not the executive register, something a step to the left of it. All of it, she said. And none of it. I knew the answer before you signed the letter, but knowing something and watching it be true are different things. Ryan looked at the reports on his laptop. The numbers, the patterns, the particular shape of a problem being understood and addressed. He thought about Sandra Coe and her 3 years of filed copies. He thought about Renata calling to ask how things felt. He thought about a woman in a gray coat in the rain, pressing 220s into his hand with the authority of someone who already knew how the story was going to go. Am I doing the job? He asked. It was direct, plainer than he usually was, but he'd decided early in the conversation that plain was the right register. Yes, she said, without hesitation. Okay. He picked up his coffee, found it cold, put it down. Then the ledger settled. She was quiet for a moment. How's Emma? She's good. Stable. She wants a fish. What kind? She hasn't specified. I think she wants one of the orange ones from Dr. Patel's waiting room. A brief sound on the line that might have been a laugh contained before it fully developed. You should get her one. I'm thinking about it. You've been thinking about it for 11 days. He stopped. How do you know that? You mentioned the fish tank in the parking garage on the day of the appointment. You have a habit of noting specific details when you're considering something. He sat with that for a second. He wasn't sure how he felt about being that readable. He thought he should probably be more careful about it, and then thought that careful was maybe not the right word, that maybe what he meant was deliberate, and that he was going to need more time to work out the distinction. Good night, Victoria, he said. Good night, Ryan. He hung up and sat in the quiet apartment with the city outside and the sound of Mr. Alvarez moving around above him, and he thought for a minute about all the pieces of the past weeks. The hallway, the rain, the parking garage, the meeting room with its lake view, the stack of Sandra's folders, Emma's half-finished braid, Dr. Patel's voice saying she's a healthy kid. He thought about what it meant to rebuild something that had been broken by someone who mistook power for strength. He looked at the reports on his laptop and closed 2 of them, because they could wait until morning, and left the one that actually required his attention open, and worked until 10:30, and went to bed. In the kitchen, the nebulizer sat on the counter, decorative. Emma slept, both braids done. The fish was named Gerald too. Emma had named it herself, on the grounds that Gerald the rabbit had seniority and deserved recognition in the naming of subsequent household members. The fish was orange, roughly the size of Ryan's thumb, and lived in a small tank on the kitchen counter next to the toaster, where it circled its plastic plant with the mild, purposeless contentment of a creature that had no concept of the world outside its water. Ryan had bought it on a Saturday morning 3 weeks into the job, on the way home from Emma's school, on impulse, from a pet store that he'd driven past 40 times without entering. He'd stood in front of the tanks for about 6 minutes, pointed at an orange one, and paid $14 for the fish and $41 for the tank and the filter and the food and the plastic plant, because the fish needed somewhere to be. Emma had received it with the controlled excitement of a child who had asked for a thing and been told we'll think about it enough times to have stopped expecting it. She'd stood at the kitchen counter for 20 minutes just watching it. He looks like the ones at Dr. Patel's, she said. That was the idea. She looked up at him. Did you plan that? No, he said, which was true. He hadn't planned anything. He'd just pulled into a parking lot and walked into a store. But intent and meaning weren't always the same thing, and he thought Gerald too probably mattered regardless of how deliberate the decision had been. By the second week, Emma had developed a one-sided relationship with the fish that involved narrating her day to it after school, which Ryan overheard from the kitchen and chose not to comment on. Gerald, too, was a good listener. He had no choice. November came in cold, the way Chicago Novembers did. Not gradually, but suddenly, as though the city had simply decided. Ryan started wearing his heavier coat, the charcoal wool one he'd owned since before Emma was born, which had one button slightly mismatched because he'd replaced it himself after the original fell off in a parking lot in Virginia 5 years ago. He'd meant to find a better match and never had, and now the mismatch button was just part of the coat. The division was not fixed. He wanted to be clear about that with himself, because he'd seen enough institutional recovery efforts to know the difference between genuine change and the temporary behavioral adjustment that follows a significant personnel event. People were being careful. Some of them were being careful because they actually understood that the previous environment had been wrong and were actively trying to do things differently. Others were being careful because they'd seen what happened to Damian Cross and Carl Eston and were making rational calculations about their own futures. Ryan didn't treat these two groups the same, but he was patient with both of them. What he focused on in the first 2 months was the specific, unglamorous work of making things function, clarifying reporting lines that had been deliberately muddied to protect Cross's information control, restoring direct communication channels between department heads that had been routed through Cross's office as a power mechanism, and spending time on the floor with people who were not department heads, the coordinators, the analysts, the administrative staff who knew exactly what was wrong with any organization because they were the ones who dealt with the consequences of every bad decision made above them. He had a habit of arriving early. Not perform arriving early, the theatrical kind that announces itself. Just actually being there at 7:15, before the day acquired its political charge. When people were getting coffee and checking their phones and were off guard in the way that produced honest answers to genuine questions. He asked a lot of genuine questions. He listened to the answers. Sandra Coe had started stopping by his office in the evenings, after most people had left, to debrief on the day, not formally, just in the manner of two people who had found a productive frequency. She'd bring her coffee, he'd be at his desk, and they'd talk through whatever was stuck or unresolved. She was direct to the point of sharpness, remembered everything, and was occasionally wrong in the specific way that confident people with strong opinions are occasionally wrong, which he appreciated because it meant she was actually telling him what she thought, rather than what she calculated he wanted to hear. Marcus in procurement is struggling, she said one evening, about 6 weeks in. Marcus was one of the employees who'd stayed on the performance improvement plan. He's doing the work correctly now, but he's doing it like a man defusing a bomb. Everything is too careful. He's not making judgment calls he should be making because he's scared to make any call at all. How long has he been like that? Since Carl left, mostly. They were close. I don't know if it was loyalty or shared culpability. Probably some of both. Ryan thought about that. I'll spend some time with him. I'm not asking you to fix him. I know. I'm just telling you so you know. He spent an afternoon with Marcus the following week. Not a formal meeting, not a performance check-in, just walking the floor of the division together while Marcus explained the procurement flow the way someone explains something they know very well and are used to explaining to people who don't understand it. Ryan asked specific questions and let Marcus answer them and watched how he talked about his work when he forgot to be scared. There was a good instinct in there, a real one. He didn't say much about it. He just stopped by Marcus's desk the next day and asked his opinion on a vendor negotiation issue Ryan was looking at, an area where Marcus had more direct experience. Marcus gave him an answer that was correct and useful. Trust your read, Ryan told him. That was the right call. Marcus looked at him with the expression of someone waiting for the other shoe. Ryan waited. The other shoe didn't come. Eventually Marcus nodded and went back to his computer, and Ryan went back to his office. What? The first time he and Victoria were in the same room for something other than a scheduled meeting was at the end of November. The forensic audit had concluded, the restatement had been filed with the relevant regulatory bodies, and the board had requested a summary presentation of the Chicago Division's corrective actions. The meeting was on the 23rd floor, in the large conference room Ryan had only been in once before, the room with the lake view, the oval table, the chairs that were slightly too comfortable for a working meeting. He arrived with a brief he'd prepared with Sandra's help, concise, factual, heavily annotated, and found the boardroom already half full. The 6 board members ranged from their mid-50s to one man who looked to be in his early 70s and sat at the far end with the particular stillness of someone who had been in many rooms like this and had long since stopped being impressed by any of them. Victoria was at the head of the table, talking with 2 of the board members in the low, efficient manner she used when she was being direct without being confrontational. She glanced up when Ryan came in, and he nodded, and she nodded back, and that was the entirety of their greeting, which was fine. He gave the presentation. He'd done enough briefings in his life to know the difference between a presentation that performed competence and one that actually conveyed it, and he stayed firmly on the side of the latter. Facts, timelines, corrective measures, projected outcomes, with the appropriate acknowledgement of uncertainty where uncertainty existed. He did not oversell. He did not hedge unnecessarily. He answered questions directly and said "I don't know yet" twice, both times in cases where he genuinely didn't know yet. The board member on the far end, the one Ryan had mentally cataloged as the senior presence, asked one question. What's the realistic timeline for this division to return to genuine performance, not managed performance? Ryan looked at him. 2 years for the culture to actually shift. 1 year before the numbers start honestly reflecting the work. Less if we don't have another significant personnel disruption. That's a longer timeline than the preliminary projections suggested. The preliminary projections were prepared by people who had career incentives to be optimistic. I don't have that incentive. A pause. The senior presence looked at him with eyes that had the quality of someone reassessing a calculation. No, he said, I suppose you don't. He made a note on the paper in front of him. Continue. The meeting lasted 2 hours. Afterward, the board filtered out in clusters, doing the particular post-meeting social maneuvering that Ryan had never had patience for. He gathered his materials and was almost at the door when the senior presence materialized beside him with the unhurried efficiency of a man who has learned to be where he intends to be without appearing to move there. Gerald Ashworth, the man said, extending his hand. Ryan Walker. I know. He had a dry, precise handshake. You know what this division was before you arrived. Broadly, yes. And you've been at this 7 weeks. 8, as of yesterday. Ashworth considered him. Victoria has good instincts, he said. She also sometimes moves faster than the available information warrants. In this case, I think the speed was justified. He said it the way men of his generation offered something that functioned as a compliment without quite committing to being one. 2 years is honest. The board needed to hear an honest number. He moved off toward the elevator. Ryan stood in the hallway for a moment. Then Victoria appeared beside him, with her leather portfolio under one arm and the look of someone who has been in a room with a board for 2 hours and is processing the residue of it. Ashworth talked to you, she said, briefly. He doesn't do that. Do what? Initiate conversation with people he's just met. She glanced at him sideways. He likes you. He doesn't know me. He knows enough. She started toward her office. Come talk to me for a few minutes. He followed her. Her office in the late afternoon had a different quality than in the morning. The light from the lake shifted, going warmer and lower, and the room felt less like a command center and more like a place someone actually spent time. She had a small credenza along one wall with a French press on it and a collection of objects that Ryan had cataloged over the course of their working relationship without meaning to. A smooth river stone that she used as a paperweight, a framed photograph turned slightly away from the room, a coffee mug from Northwestern that had a chip on the rim and appeared to be her actual preferred mug rather than the matching set in the cabinet above. She poured 2 cups of coffee without asking and handed him one, and he took it and sat down across from her, and she sat behind the desk in the formal arrangement this time, which told him this was something she wanted to be clear about. The board approved the divisional restructuring, she said. Full budget, full authority. You can build the team you actually need rather than the one you inherited. Ryan looked at his coffee. That's earlier than I expected. Ashworth moved it. He doesn't usually move things this quickly either. She watched him. This is good news. I know it is. You look like a man doing math. He looked up. I'm thinking about who to promote and who to hire external and how to sequence it so the people who've been holding this place together don't feel like they're being bypassed by outsiders. Sandra Coe. Her and 3 others. They've been doing director-level work at coordinator salaries for years. I want that fixed before I bring anyone new in. Victoria was quiet for a moment. She turned her coffee mug slowly on the desk, a small, habitual gesture he'd noticed before. Do you know what the previous 3 people I considered for your position said when I described the scope of the role? No. The first one asked about the title. The second one asked about the car allowance. The third one gave me a 90-day strategic transformation plan he'd clearly prepared before the meeting. She paused. You asked about Emma's insurance. Ryan didn't say anything. I'm not telling you that to make a point about your character, she said. I'm telling you because it's relevant to something I want to talk about. She set the mug down. The board is going to ask me about a longer-term leadership structure for this division. They want a VP of operations for Chicago. An actual VP, not a director equivalent. The title, the authority, the seat at the table when divisional strategy gets set. He held her gaze. You're asking me to be a VP. I'm telling you the board is going to ask me about it. I wanted to tell you before they did, so you could think about it rather than react to it. He sat with that. He thought about what the job he had now actually required of him, and whether what she was describing was a different job or the same job with a different nameplate, and what the practical distinction would mean for the people in the division who were starting to trust the direction things were moving. What changes? He asked. Board visibility, compensation commensurate with that level, broader authority over cross-divisional decisions. She paused. More of my attention, which some people find valuable and others find uncomfortable. Which kind of people find it uncomfortable? People who want the authority without the accountability. He looked at her. You already know what I'm going to say. Yes. I wanted to hear you say it. I need to know it doesn't change the work. The actual work. Being present, being accessible, doing the morning walkthroughs. If the title becomes a reason to stop doing those things, then it's not worth the title. She held his gaze for a moment with that quality he'd cataloged over 8 weeks. The sharp attention, the stillness that wasn't passivity, but was actually the most active form of listening. Then it won't change those things, she said. I'll put it in writing. He nodded. Okay? Okay, you'll take it? Okay, I'll take it. Same answer as last time. She almost smiled again. That contained compression that he'd decided was actually her real smile. Not a suppressed version of a larger one, but the authentic expression itself, small and unannounced. The board meets again in January, she said. I'll put the proposal forward then. He stood. He picked up the coffee cup and then paused, which was something he did when he had one more thing and was deciding whether to say it. The photograph, he said, nodding toward the credenza. She looked at him. What about it? It's turned away from the room. Every other object in here faces outward. He wasn't sure why he said it. He wasn't sure it was his business. He'd said it anyway, which he was going to think about later. Victoria looked at the credenza. The photograph, framed, turned at an angle that showed only its back, sat between the river stone and the northwestern mug. She was quiet for a moment. My father, she said, he died 4 years ago. Before the company was what it is now. She paused. I keep it there because I want it near me, and I turn it because I don't always want to be looking at it. Ryan stood in the doorway and didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say that would improve on the honesty of what she'd just offered. He went back to his office. But December arrived and brought with it the particular compressed quality of the end of a year, the budgeting cycle, the performance review period, the annual all-staff meeting that Ryan ran for the first time with the help of Sandra and a logistics coordinator named Phil, who had strong opinions about AV setup and turned out to be indispensable because of it. The all-staff meeting was 3 hours on a Thursday morning in the large ground-floor conference space with folding chairs and a temporary podium and the slightly chaotic energy of 300 people being assembled in one room. Ryan didn't use the podium. He'd never been comfortable behind a lectern. It put a barrier between you and whoever you were talking to, and he preferred to be findable. He talked for 20 minutes without notes, which had made Sandra nervous when he told her the plan, and which turned out fine because he knew what he wanted to say. He talked about where the division had been and where it was going, with specifics rather than inspiration. The restatement was completed, the audit was closed, the structural revisions were underway, and the performance trajectory for Q4 was showing real numbers rather than managed ones, which meant some of the figures were lower than what the previous reports had claimed, and some were higher. He told them which was which. He told them that 3 department heads had received title and compensation adjustments effective January, and named them. Sandra was in the 3rd row, and when he said her name and new title, Director of Divisional Logistics, with appropriate compensation, She looked at the middle distance with the particular stillness of someone receiving information they'd been waiting years to hear and had stopped expecting. She didn't look at him. She looked at the wall, and her jaw was very set, and Ryan looked away from her quickly because it was her moment and not his. He took questions for 40 minutes. Some of them were about compensation equity. There was a disparity between two departments that had never been addressed, and two people raised it, separately, both carefully, both clearly expecting to be managed rather than answered. He told them the disparity was real, that he'd identified it, and that it would be corrected in the January compensation cycle. He told them the timeline and the mechanism and the person responsible for confirming it, which was him. He answered 7 more questions. He got 2 things wrong, meaning he gave answers that turned out to be incomplete when he looked into them afterward. And he sent a division-wide message the following morning with the corrections, which was the kind of thing that sounds minor and isn't. Afterward, Renata found him by the coffee station. He hadn't seen her since the meeting room on the 22nd floor, 2 months ago, the day Victoria had slid 2 $20 bills across the table and fired Damien Cross. Renata was in a different uniform now, not the cleaning service green, but the building management khaki that meant she was Apex Meridian staff, permanent, with a badge that said Facilities Manager in clean type. She looked good. She looked rested in a way she hadn't looked that night in the hallway, and she carried herself differently, not with arrogance, not with performance, just with the specific confidence of someone who has been recognized and knows it. "Mr. Walker," she said. "Renata." He shook her hand. "How's the new role?" "Good?" She said it simply, without qualification. "Strange at first, but good." She held her coffee cup with both hands. "I wanted to say what you did that night. I have thought about it many times. You don't need to— I know I don't need to," she said, with the mild directness that he remembered from the hallway. "I want to. There is a difference." She paused. 11 years I cleaned that building. I have been treated many ways by many people. What you did, it was not a large thing from the outside, but from where I was standing, it was the only thing. Ryan didn't know what to do with that exactly. He wasn't good at receiving certain kinds of things. He'd learned to receive criticism and instruction and even professional recognition with equanimity, but gratitude of the specific personal kind that Renata was offering had a different texture that he didn't have as clean a handling for. "I'm glad you're here," he said finally, meaning the building, meaning the job, meaning the way she was standing, like she'd earned the ground under her feet, which she had long before any of them noticed. She nodded. "Sandra Coe," she said. "The new title." That was right. "Yes," he said. "The people who kept this place honest when it was hard to— they should know they were seen." She said it like a principle, not a sentiment. "That's all." She went back toward the facilities corridor, coffee in hand, unhurried. Ryan stood by the coffee station for a moment. The room was emptying around him, staff moving back toward their floors, the folding chairs being stacked by Phil, and 2 volunteers from operations. The specific energy of the meeting was dissipating, and what was settling in its place was something Ryan didn't have an exact word for. Not satisfaction, which sounded too resolved, and not pride, which sounded too self-regarding, but something in that neighborhood. The specific quality of work that's actually doing what you intended it to do. He got a coffee, because the first one was gone, and took the elevator up. But the call from Damien Cross came on a Tuesday in mid-December on Ryan's personal cell at 6:47 in the morning. Ryan saw the number, unknown but Chicago area code, and picked up because he always picked up Chicago area codes in the morning in case it was Emma's school. "Walker." The voice was recognizable immediately. Changed in register, thinner, less controlled, but the same. Ryan stood in his kitchen in the early morning quiet and said nothing. "I know it's you," Damien said. "I know you can hear me." "I can," Ryan said. A pause. Ryan could hear the quality of the space Damien was calling from. Not an office, not a controlled environment, something ambient. Maybe a car. "You should know that what happened to me." "I'm pursuing legal action," Damien said. "Wrongful termination. Victoria Sterling doesn't get to build a public narrative about me without there being a response." "Okay," Ryan said. I'm not calling to threaten you. I'm calling because you were involved, and your name will come up in the process. I understand. I want you to know that I know what you did. You went to her. After I had you terminated, you went directly to her and you fed her a story, and she made a decision based on your version of events. Ryan thought about that hallway on the 38th floor. He thought about Damien's face when he said people like you. He thought about Renata pressed against the wall with her hands clasped, trying to disappear. Victoria was in the hallway, Ryan said. Silence. She saw the same thing I saw. She was standing 6 feet away from you. He kept his voice level. You don't have a version of events problem, Damien. You have a witness problem. The line was quiet long enough that Ryan wasn't sure Damien was still there. You think you're better than me, Damien said finally. The control in his voice had frayed visibly. You're running a division you never would have touched if a billionaire hadn't decided you were her charity project. Ryan looked at Gerald too, circling the plastic plant. I think we're done talking, he said. I'm going to... Call your lawyer, Ryan said. Don't call me again. He hung up. He stood in the kitchen for a moment. The coffee maker was finishing its cycle, the specific sound of the last of the water moving through. Emma would be up in 20 minutes. The day was already scheduled. 2 meetings, a procurement review, a one-on-one with Marcus that Ryan was looking forward to because Marcus had started, slowly, to trust his own judgment again. He poured a cup of coffee. He thought about what Damien had said, charity project, and looked at it honestly, the way he tried to look at things that were intended to hurt, to see if there was anything in them worth taking seriously. He turned it over. He considered it from the angle Damien intended, and then from the angle that was actually true. Victoria had been in that hallway. She'd watched what happened. She'd made a decision based on what she'd seen. Ryan had not gone to her, had not lobbied for anything, had not leveraged the situation. He'd walked home in the rain and updated his resume and worried about his daughter's insurance and not once considered that the cleaning woman in the gray coat was going to call him from a boardroom. He hadn't earned this job by being in the right place. He'd earned it by being the kind of person who gets off the elevator. He didn't know if that was better or worse than what Damien was suggesting. He knew it was true. He drank his coffee. In the hallway, Emma's door opened, and she appeared in her pajamas with Gerald the rabbit under one arm and her hair at approximately maximum entropy, squinting at the kitchen light. Is it a school day? She asked. Tuesday. She considered the implications of this. I'm going to make the toast today, she said. I'll supervise. I don't need supervision. I'll observe. She went to the toaster with the focused expression of someone who intended to do things differently this time. And Ryan stood at the counter with his coffee and watched her. And the morning did what mornings did, moved forward, indifferent to what came before it, making room for whatever came next. The toast was not burned. Emma stood at the counter on a Thursday morning in late February and looked at 2 perfectly browned slices with the expression of someone who has achieved a thing and is not yet sure how they feel about having achieved it because the journey had become part of the identity. It's done, she said. Ryan looked up from his coffee. Good color. It doesn't look right. It looks exactly right. That's what right looks like. She picked up 1 slice and inspected it with the critical attention she applied to things she'd previously failed at. She took a bite. She chewed. She looked at the wall. It's okay, she said finally. High praise from a tough critic. The burned one had more flavor. Ryan looked at her over his mug. Emma, that's not true. It's a little true. She took another bite. Maybe I like burned toast. Maybe you've been burning it on purpose. What? She didn't answer, which was its own answer, and Ryan looked at his daughter, at her half-finished braid and her school sweater with the small ink stain on the left cuff that hadn't come out in 3 washes, at the way she stood at the counter with her weight on 1 foot, and thought about how she had her mother's nose and his stubbornness and her own particular way of turning failure into preference, which was entirely her and nobody else. Bus in 20 minutes, he said. I know. She put the toast down and went to gather her bag, and Gerald too circled the plastic plant, and the apartment smelled like coffee and morning, and Ryan sat with it for a moment before the day asked anything of him. The legal action Damien Cross had mentioned on the phone in December had materialized in January as a formal wrongful termination complaint, filed through a law firm that specialized in executive employment disputes and that had a reputation, according to Apex Meridian's general counsel, for aggressive discovery requests and protracted timelines. The complaint named Victoria personally and the company broadly, and alleged that the termination had been based on fabricated misconduct claims orchestrated by a subordinate employee, Ryan, in retaliation for a legitimate disciplinary action. Ryan had read the complaint in the general counsel's office on a Monday morning, sitting across from a woman named Patricia Hale, who had been the company's chief legal officer for 9 years, and who read the document with the specific neutrality of someone who has seen many complaints and is performing triage. "He's alleging you had a pre-existing relationship with the CEO," Patricia had told him, "that the undercover operation was staged to create grounds for his termination." Ryan looked at her. "I didn't know who she was until I walked into a boardroom and recognized the woman I'd met in a hallway." "I know that. Victoria knows that. The claim is that it can't be proven. There are building security records. The elevator system logs every access card movement. My card accessed the 38th floor at 11:14 p.m. on October 14th for approximately 12 minutes, which is consistent with the account I've given. I had no prior record of accessing that floor." Patricia had looked at him with the mild recalibration that people performed when they discovered, unexpectedly, that someone they'd assessed as useful had already done the work they were about to suggest. "I'll subpoena those records," she said. "You should also pull Damien's access records for that floor over the preceding 3 months," Ryan said. "I'd be interested in how often he was there after hours and whether the cleaning schedule correlates." She'd written something down. "You'd have been good in litigation." "I just know how to read a pattern." The lawsuit had been one of those sustained background pressures that occupied a specific register of attention, never the loudest thing in the room, but always present, the way a low sound becomes part of the ambient noise until you can't remember what quiet used to mean. Ryan had dealt with it by staying exactly as operational as he'd been before it was filed, on the theory that the best counter-narrative to a claim about pre-existing conspiracy was a division that was visibly, documentably functioning better. By February, the Q4 numbers were in. Real numbers, unmanipulated, honestly reflecting what the Chicago division had actually done in the final quarter of a year that had started with forensic auditors in the building and 3 department heads on performance plans. The division had not had a spectacular quarter. It had had a solid one, numbers that were lower in some categories than the falsified reports had previously claimed, and higher in others, which was exactly what Ryan had told the board to expect, and which the board appeared to be processing with something approaching confidence. Gerald Ashworth had sent him an email. 3 sentences. Solid quarter. Honest numbers. Keep going. Ryan had read it twice and then forwarded it to Sandra with no comment, because she'd done more to produce those numbers than he had, and she deserved to know that someone at the board level was paying attention. Sandra had written back, "About time." 2 words. He'd considered that fair. The lawsuit was dismissed in the 3rd week of February. Patricia Hale called Ryan at 4:15 on a Wednesday afternoon, and he could tell from the specific quality of her voice, the controlled brevity of someone delivering a clean result, before she said the words. "The judge granted summary dismissal," she said. "The security records were dispositive. There was no evidence of prior relationship between you and Victoria Sterling, no evidence of coordinated action, and no basis for the fabricated misconduct claim given that the claimant's own conduct was documented by 3 independent witnesses, including the CEO of the company." She paused. "It's over." Ryan sat at his desk and looked out at the lake. February lake, cold and heavy, the color of old pewter, honest about what it was. "Cross's legal fees?" he asked. "His own. The judge declined to award costs to Apex Meridian, which is standard at this stage, but he gets nothing. He spent 4 months and presumably significant money to get exactly where he started, minus the reputation." She paused. "He also filed a complaint with the State Labor Board in January. That was dismissed last week. I didn't mention it because there was nothing to do about it. It was procedurally deficient from the start." "Is there anything else in the pipeline?" "Not that we can identify. His firm withdrew from representation, which usually signals the client has run out of appetite or funds for further action. Ryan nodded to himself. Thank you, Patricia. That's what I'm here for. A brief pause. For what it's worth, the way you handled this process, not once did you do anything that could have been used against you. You were clean the whole way through. I just did my job. That's what I mean, she said, and hung up. He sat for a moment. He thought about Damien Cross in whatever space he was occupying now, not with satisfaction, exactly, and not with sympathy either, but with the specific clarity that comes when you understand how a person ended up where they are. Damien had spent 20 years accumulating power through the threat of consequences, and when the threat stopped working, he had nothing else. The arrogance hadn't been incidental to his character. It had been structural. Take it away, and there was no load-bearing wall underneath. Ryan didn't enjoy that understanding, but he thought it was important to sit with it rather than replace it with something simpler. Simple feelings about complicated situations were usually just comfort dressed as clarity. He called Victoria. She picked up on the second ring. Patricia told me, she said. I figured. How do you feel? He thought about it honestly. Relieved, he said, and a little tired in the way you get tired when something that's been sitting in the background finally stops. Yes, she said. That's exactly it. A pause. Dinner. Tonight, if you can. Not a meeting. Dinner. There's a place on the river I've been meaning to try, and I keep canceling the reservation because something comes up. He registered the distinction she'd made, not a meeting, and turned it over for a second. They'd had dinner twice before, both times in the context of working through something specific. The forensic audit findings once, the Q3 restatement once. This was different. She was flagging the difference deliberately, because Victoria did very few things without intention. Emma has a school thing until 7, he said. 8 o'clock. Okay. Ryan. Her voice changed register slightly, the way it did when she was being precise about something. I'm aware this is... I want to be straightforward about the fact that this is outside our professional context. If that's uncomfortable, say so. He looked at the lake. It's not uncomfortable, and he said. A pause. Good. Back to the normal register. 8 o'clock. I'll have Diane send you the address. He hung up and sat at his desk and thought about the photograph on her credenza, turned away from the room, toward the wall, near enough to be present but not demanding to be looked at. He thought about a river stone used as a paperweight and a chipped coffee mug, and the way she'd said, I keep canceling the reservation because something comes up, which was a thing most people would say, and which, coming from her, meant she'd been thinking about it long enough to have canceled it more than once. He thought about a hallway on the 38th floor 4 months ago, and how many things had to go differently for the next 4 months to have been anything other than what they'd been. He went back to work. He had a procurement review in 20 minutes and a call with the divisional counsel at 5, and the day still had several hours left in it, and the lake was going to be there regardless. Dinner was not remarkable in the ways that matter for the record, and entirely remarkable in the ways that don't. The restaurant was a small Italian place 3 blocks off the river, not the kind with a view, just the kind with good food and enough ambient noise that a conversation could be private without being hushed. Victoria was already there when he arrived, which surprised him. He'd assumed she'd be late, because she was the kind of person whose schedule ran against her even when she managed it carefully. But she was there, in a corner booth, in dark clothes with her hair loose in a way he'd never seen it at work, looking at the menu with the focused attention she brought to everything. She looked up when he sat down. You're on time, she said. I'm always on time. I know. I've noticed. She set the menu down. I'm almost always late. I know. I've noticed. She looked at him with that almost smile. We should order wine. I don't drink much, but tonight feels like it warrants something. They ordered wine and food and spent the first 20 minutes talking about things adjacent to work. The board's posture going into Q1, a hiring decision Ryan had pending, a logistics technology platform Sandra had flagged as worth evaluating. It was comfortable, which was what he'd expected, because they'd always been comfortable in that register. What surprised him was how easily it shifted. Not at a defined moment, but gradually. The way a conversation that's been running along the surface finds a different depth without anyone deciding to go there. She talked about her father. Not the photograph on the credenza, but the person. A man who had run a small transportation company in downstate Illinois, and who had worked 18-hour days for 20 years and had never quite gotten the business to the scale he believed it could reach. He had died of a heart attack at 61, 2 years before Apex Meridian had its first significant growth year, and Victoria had spent a long time afterward carrying the specific, unresolvable grief of someone who has achieved the thing and cannot share it with the person it was partly built for. He would have hated the board meetings, she said. He had no patience for that kind of process. He wanted to talk to the people who actually did the work. Ryan thought about that. He sounds like someone who would have gotten off the elevator. She looked at him. Something in her expression shifted, not visibly, just in the quality of the attention behind it. Yes, she said. He would have. They sat with that for a moment. Around them, the restaurant did what restaurants do. The particular sound of other people's evenings running parallel, glasses and conversation, and the occasional laugh from somewhere across the room. Can I ask you something? Ryan said. Yes. The night in the hallway, when you gave the $40 back in the rain outside the building, you'd already made the decision at that point. She didn't answer immediately. She turned her wine glass slowly, the same small habit as the coffee mug. I'd made a decision, she said carefully. I wasn't certain it was the right one yet. What made you certain? You took the money, she said. He waited. A different person, in that situation, would have refused it out of pride. The same $40 that you'd given me, coming back, a lot of people would have made that about their ego. You took it because you needed it, and refusing it wouldn't have made your situation better. She paused. I spent 6 weeks watching people in that building make calculations. Most of the calculations were about appearances. Yours weren't. She looked at him directly. That was when I was certain. Ryan thought about standing in the rain outside Apex Meridian with his wet coat and the laminated insurance card in his wallet. He thought about taking the money. He hadn't thought about it as a decision at the time. He'd just done it because he'd needed it, and she'd offered it, and dignity wasn't the same thing as stubbornness. But she was right that it was a choice and that it revealed something, and that she had been watching closely enough to see it. You're very good at watching, he said. I've had to be. She said it without self-pity, just as a fact about the specific condition of being a young woman in a room full of people who'd already decided what she was. When you're the youngest person in every room, and often the only woman, you learn to read the room before the room reads you. She paused. Or you don't, and you spend a lot of time being surprised. He nodded. He understood reading rooms for different reasons, in different contexts, but he understood the principle. Emma, she said, shifting, tell me something she's done recently that made you laugh. He thought about it. She decided Gerald too needed a friend. She made a case for a second fish that lasted 3 evenings and included a diagram. Victoria looked at him. A diagram. On notebook paper, she drew Gerald too looking lonely. His face was just a circle with 2 dots for eyes and a frown, and then drew Gerald too with a friend, where the friend had a smile, and Gerald too also had a smile, and there was a legend explaining the emotional states. He paused. The argument was essentially that Gerald too's quality of life was being negatively impacted by isolation. Victoria was quiet for a second, then she laughed. A real one, not the contained version, a sound that surprised her slightly, and that she didn't try to pull back. Did it work? We have 2 fish now. The new one is named Gerald 3. She shook her head slowly, still smiling. She's something. She is, he said, simply and completely. They stayed until the restaurant was mostly empty, which was later than either of them had planned. They walked out into the February night, which had the particular cold clarity of a city that has been winter for a long time and is not yet done with it. The air sharp and still, the river black between its banks, the lights of the bridges doing their work. They stood on the sidewalk for a moment. I'm going to tell you something, Victoria said, and I want you to just hear it rather than respond to it. He waited. 4 months ago, I was running a company that I'd built from the ground up, and I was doing it alone in the specific way that you can be surrounded by people and still be doing something essentially alone. Not because I didn't have good people, because trust is the thing that takes the longest to build, and I hadn't I hadn't let myself build it with anyone in particular. She stopped. And then I watched a man get off an elevator for no reason that benefited him whatsoever, and I thought, that's the thing I've been looking for. Not in a professional sense. The city made its sounds around them. Somewhere down the block a cab passed, its light orange in the dark. Ryan was quiet for the beat she'd asked for. Then he said, I heard it. She looked at him. And I've been doing the same thing, he said. The alone thing. For different reasons, but the same shape. He looked at the river. Emma keeps asking why I don't have friends over. I've been telling her I've been busy. Are you busy? I've been careful, he said, which I told myself was the same thing. She nodded slowly. I know that distinction. They stood there a moment longer, and then the February cold made the decision for them the way cold makes decisions. Not dramatically, just insistently. She said goodnight, and he said goodnight, and she walked toward where her car was waiting, and he walked toward the parking garage, and neither of them said anything about what came next, which was fine, because some things don't need to be scheduled to be real. Spring came the way Chicago spring comes, reluctantly, in fits, the temperature rising for 3 days and then dropping back, as though the city needed to reconsider. But it came. By April, the lake had changed color, going from winter pewter to something lighter and more provisional, and Emma started leaving her coat at home and then having to call Ryan at 8:15 from the school office because she was cold. He started keeping a spare jacket in the car. The division, by April, was running. Not perfectly. He would not have said perfectly, because he'd learned to be careful with that word, which had a way of replacing the real condition with a performance of it. But genuinely. The department heads met on Tuesdays, and the conversations were substantive and occasionally contentious, which was healthy. Sandra had hired 2 people into her department and managed them with the specific directness of someone who had spent years being managed incorrectly and had therefore thought carefully about how not to do it. Marcus had closed a vendor negotiation in March that saved the division a significant amount on its material sourcing, and he'd done it on his own instincts, and he'd been right. Phil, the logistics coordinator with strong opinions about AV, had turned out to have strong opinions about a lot of things that were consistently worth hearing, and Ryan had moved him into a project management role that gave those opinions the structure to become results. Renata ran facilities with the specific authority of someone who knows the building in the way that only people who have cleaned every floor of it at midnight actually know a building. She had identified 3 maintenance issues in the first month that had been deferred for years under the previous management structure, had proposed solutions with cost breakdowns, and had gotten them approved and completed. Ryan had signed off on her proposals with one note. Good work. Trust your read. He'd written the same note to 3 other people that month. He was starting to notice it was becoming a phrase. The board approved the VP of Operations title in January, as Victoria had said they would. The compensation adjustment was significant enough that Ryan had sat with it for a few minutes and then called Carla. You're going to tell me it's too much, Carla had said. I'm going to tell you Emma needs a bigger room. A pause. Are you moving? I'm looking. Something with 2 bedrooms and not a dripping faucet. Ryan. Her voice had a quality he recognized. The relief that people who have been worried for a long time allow themselves when the worry is officially over. Okay, good. Don't make it a thing. I'm not making it a thing. I'm just... She stopped. I'm glad. Okay? I'm just glad. He let her be glad. It cost nothing, and she'd earned it. The apartment they found in March was in Lincoln Park. 2 bedrooms, a bathroom without a dripping faucet, a kitchen with enough counter space that Gerald 2 and Gerald 3 had their own dedicated wall, which Emma had specified as a non-negotiable requirement before she'd agreed to look at any unit. The 2nd bedroom was hers, small and bright, with a window that looked out at a courtyard where a maple tree was, by April, beginning to consider the idea of leaves. Emma had stood in the center of her new room on move-in day and turned in a slow circle with her arms out, which was a thing she did when she was assessing a space. It needs stuff, she said. We'll get stuff. Can I put glow stars on the ceiling? It's your ceiling. She looked up at it. Gerald 3 goes by the window, she said, so he can see the tree. Gerald 3 doesn't have opinions about trees. You don't know that, she said, with the specific confidence of someone who has studied the subject. He didn't argue. They put the fish tank by the window. The thing Ryan had said to Victoria on the sidewalk in February about being careful instead of busy, about the same shape of alone, was the kind of thing that doesn't go back into the container once it's been said. Not in a damaging way. Just in the way that honesty, once offered and received, changes the ground between two people. They had dinner again in March, and twice in April. He did not examine it too carefully because he'd learned that examining certain things too carefully was a way of not letting them be what they were. What it was, he could say plainly, he looked forward to talking to her. Not because she was the CEO and not because she was remarkable in the ways that the public record noted, but because she thought carefully and said what she meant and didn't perform ease. She was exactly as comfortable or uncomfortable as the situation warranted, and she didn't sand the edges off either one. She met Emma in April, which Ryan had not planned. It happened the way unplanned things happen. Emma's school had a half day, Ryan's afternoon was unavoidably scheduled, and he brought Emma to the office because Diane had offered, in the entirely genuine and non-performative way Diane offered things, to keep an eye on her while Ryan was in his 3:30 meeting. Emma had been in Diane's office for 40 minutes, and when Ryan came out of his meeting, he found them both at Diane's desk with a game of cribbage in progress, which was a card game Ryan had not known Diane played and which Emma had apparently learned in under 20 minutes. Victoria had walked past on her way back from the elevator and had stopped. Ryan had watched the moment. Emma looked up from the cards, and there was a half second where she was just reading the new person the way she read everyone, with that direct patient assessment. And then she said, "You're Victoria." Victoria had looked slightly surprised. "Yes." "How did you know?" "Dad has a rhythm when he says your name," Emma said. "It sounds different than work names." A silence of about 3 seconds in which Ryan focused on the middle distance. "Does it?" Victoria said. "He's doing the jaw thing," Emma told her. "I'm not—" Ryan stopped. He was. Victoria had looked at him with a quality in her expression that he was going to think about for a while. The particular quality of someone who is trying not to show how much something has landed. She'd looked back at Emma. "I've heard a lot about you," she said. Emma considered her. "He told me you came to his office when you were pretending to be someone else." "I was working. Undercover." "Why?" "To find out the truth about something." Emma thought about this with the seriousness she brought to legitimately interesting information. "Did it work?" Victoria glanced at Ryan. "Yes," she said. "It worked." Emma nodded slowly, accepting the verdict. Then she looked at the cribbage board. "Do you know how to play cribbage?" "I don't." "I just learned. I can teach you." She looked at Diane. "Is that okay?" Diane, who was 62 years old and had managed executives for 30 years and was not easily surprised, looked at the ceiling briefly and then said, "I'll get another chair." Ryan had gone back to his office and stood at the window for a moment with the lake in front of him, and he thought about timing, about the specific, unearnable quality of finding the right thing at a moment in your life when you are actually able to recognize it for what it is. He'd been 34 when Emma's mother left. He'd been 35 when he finally admitted he didn't know how to do this alone even though he was doing it. He'd been 37 when he got off an elevator on the 38th floor because something in him that he'd tried to put away had refused to stay put. You couldn't plan any of that. You could only be ready when it arrived, and readiness wasn't a state you achieved. It was a choice you kept making, every day, in small ways that accumulated into something larger than any single decision. What? There was a thing Ryan had learned in the military, and later in the specific life he'd built around Emma's health and his own limitations, that he didn't have a clean way to articulate, but that had shaped almost every important decision he'd made. It had to do with the difference between the things you do because they benefit you and the things you do because they're right, and why those two categories aren't supposed to be entirely separate, but too often are. Most people, in that hallway on the 38th floor, would have let the elevator doors close. Ryan would have let them close too, on a different night, in a different state of mind. He didn't think of himself as someone who acted on principle consistently and without calculation. He was too aware of his own calculations for that. What happened that night was simpler. The doors opened, and he saw what was happening, and the version of him that had spent 11 years being trained to protect people who couldn't protect themselves was more present than the version that had spent 3 years learning to stay quiet. He hadn't saved anyone. Renata had been dealing with men like Damian Cross for 30 years. She would have handled it and survived it and clocked in again the next night. Victoria had already been watching for 6 weeks and had already made her assessments. Ryan was data, not rescue. What he'd done was simpler and in some ways more important than rescue. He just refused to be the person who watched. He'd refused to perform the collective silence that gave people like Damian Cross their oxygen. He thought about that sometimes, on the mornings he drove Emma to school and stood in the drop-off line and watched her walk through the double doors with her bag listing to the left. He thought about what it cost, in different contexts, to refuse to perform the silence. In the hallway, it had cost him his job. In most situations, it cost considerably less, a small friction, a moment of discomfort, the mild social penalty of being the person in the room who said the thing. People didn't act because the cost seemed too high. Most of the time, the actual cost was much lower than the anticipated cost, and the gap between those two numbers was where a lot of preventable harm lived. He wasn't sure what to do with that understanding, except to try to remember it consistently, and to build a division where the structures made it easier rather than harder to say the thing, where the cost of honesty was lower than the cost of silence. That was the work. It was not glamorous work, and it was not finished work. It was the kind of work that had to be recommitted to every morning, because institutions didn't maintain themselves, and culture was not a thing you set and walked away from. He understood that. He was fine with that. He had a 7-year-old who burned toast on purpose and named fish with a filing system and argued about shark taxonomy with her classmates, and was, by all available evidence, becoming a person with very strong opinions and the specific courage to hold them. Whatever he was building at work, that was the one he was most committed to getting right. On a Thursday evening in early May, Ryan stayed late, not because anything was urgent, just because the evening was quiet in the particular way he still preferred. The building had mostly emptied. The 42nd floor, where he'd once sat at 11 p.m. squinting at spreadsheets, was dark above him. His office had the last light of a spring evening coming through the lake window. He had his desk drawer open. The two $20 bills were in there, folded small, worn at the creases from being folded and unfolded. He'd put them in the drawer on his first day and hadn't moved them. They sat among a few other objects that had accumulated over the months. A cribbage card Emma had left during her visit to the office, a pen Sandra had loaned him, and that he'd kept by accident and she'd waved off when he tried to return it, a printed copy of Gerald Ashworth's 3-sentence email. He picked up the two 20s and held them for a moment. He thought about what they'd meant at each stage they'd passed through. Money he'd given without expecting return, money given back as a gesture he hadn't fully understood, money he'd taken in the rain because he'd needed it, and ego wasn't the same as dignity, money that had sat on a boardroom table as evidence of something true, money in a drawer as a reminder. He thought about what it meant that a single ordinary decision on an ordinary late night had rerouted everything. Not because it was miraculous, it wasn't miraculous, it was just the product of a set of choices meeting a set of circumstances at the right angle. But because it was a reminder of something that was easy to forget when you were being careful, when you were managing the margin, when you were keeping your head down and protecting the things that needed protecting. The moments that change your life don't announce themselves as that. They just arrive as situations, usually inconvenient, usually asking something from you that you weren't planning to give, and you either answer them or you don't. He'd answered one. He'd gotten lucky in what followed. He knew that, and he didn't minimize it. Victoria had been there. The situation had resolved in a direction it didn't have to resolve in. A different night, a different executive, a different CEO, and the same choice might have cost him much more and returned much less. But the choice would have still been the right one. He put the two 20s back in the drawer and closed it. He was going to keep them, not as a monument to the moment. He was constitutionally unsuited to monuments, but as what they actually were. An ordinary amount of money that had done an amount of work far in excess of its monetary value, which was true of certain things in this world and worth remembering. His phone buzzed. Emma, from Carla's phone. She was spending the evening with her aunt, who'd driven up from Phoenix for a long weekend and who was currently, according to Emma's last message, losing at gin rummy. Aunt Carla says your job sounds good now. He typed back. It is. She also says you should get a plant for the new apartment. What kind? A pause while she consulted. She says something you can't kill by accident. I said you already have fish. He smiled at his phone. Tell Aunt Carla I'll think about the plant. That means no. It means I'll think about it. He put his phone in his pocket and picked up his jacket and turned off the office light. The lake was still out there, going about its ancient, indifferent business, absorbing the last of the evening light, moving in the way deep water moves, which looks like stillness from a distance and is anything but. He stood at the window for a moment, coat over his arm, looking at it. He had not set out to become the person he was now occupying. He'd set out to keep his daughter safe and his job stable and his life manageable, and those were not small ambitions. They were the right size for what he'd had available. But the world had a way of expanding what was possible when you refused to participate in its smaller versions of itself. He turned off the light and took the elevator down. Outside, Chicago in May was making its argument for itself. The air with that particular quality of a city warming up. Not summer yet, but the actual intention of it. The trees on Michigan Avenue in that early leaf that looked provisional but wasn't. He walked to the parking garage, unhurried. He had a daughter to pick up, and a sister to say hello to, and a new apartment with a maple tree in the courtyard, and 2 fish by the window. He had work to do tomorrow that was worth doing, and people who were counting on it being done honestly. He had, sitting in a drawer on the 22nd floor, 2 folded 20s that would probably stay there as long as he did. And he had, somewhere in the architecture of his days, the settled understanding that the best things in his life had arrived, not because he'd planned for them, but because, on a night when every reasonable instinct told him to let the elevator doors close, he'd gotten out anyway. That was the whole of it. That was everything.